Poor girl pleads for her sick mum's medicine. The millionaire's response shocked everyone. The night sky was covered in thick grey clouds, hiding the stars. A chilling wind howled through the narrow streets, rattling old windows. Emily, a fragile little girl, stepped carefully along the icy sidewalk. Her shoes were too small and cracked at the seams. Cold air slipped through the holes, stinging her toes. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her small body. The coat had once been warm, but now the fabric was torn. A button was missing, forcing her to hold it closed with one hand. In her other hand, she clutched a small rusted tin box. The box rattled faintly with a few coins inside. Emily had been saving those coins for weeks. She had collected them by running errands for neighbors. Sometimes she picked up empty bottles to sell for pennies. Each coin meant sacrifice, but also hope. Tonight, however, the coins did not feel enough. Her mother's labored breathing echoed in Emily's memory. The doctor's voice replayed in her head. She needs medicine, urgently. But medicine cost far more than what Emily had. She bit her lip, fighting back tears. Crying would not help her mother. She needed courage, not weakness. She stepped past a bakery, its window glowing with golden light. The smell of warm bread drifted into the cold air. Her empty stomach growled, but she ignored it. Food could wait, her mother could not. She whispered a small prayer under her breath. Please, God, help me tonight. Don't let me fail Mama. Her tiny breath came out as white clouds of steam. She rubbed her frozen fingers together, wishing for gloves. Passing children ran by in wool coats and scarves. They laughed, holding bags of sweets in their hands. Emily lowered her eyes, afraid they would notice her shabby clothes. She was used to being invisible, but tonight she needed to be seen. She stopped. It outside the first pharmacy she found. Its bright sign buzzed with light. She pressed her nose against the cold glass, peering inside. Rows of medicine bottles lined the shelves. It looked like a world of miracles beyond the door. Emily pushed the door open slowly. A bell chimed, startling her. The warmth inside made her cheeks tingle. The pharmacist looked up from his counter. His eyes scanned her worn-out clothes. Emily walked up timidly, clutching her box of coins. Sir, my mum needs medicine, she whispered. The man frowned slightly, leaning down to hear. She carefully unfolded the doctor's note she had been guarding. The paper was wrinkled from being held too tightly. He read the name of the medicine, then sighed. This is very expensive, he muttered. Emily's heart sank immediately. I have some money, she said quickly. She opened her little box, showing the coins. The clinking sound seemed embarrassingly small. The pharmacist shook his head slowly. I'm sorry, little one. This won't be enough. Emily's throat tightened, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded and closed the box. She whispered, Thank you anyway, and turned away. The bell rang again as she stepped outside. The cold hit her harder this time. She took a shaky breath, reminding herself she couldn't give up. There had to be another way. She wandered to the next shop down the street. The windows there were dark. The store had already closed. She pressed her small hand against the glass. Her reflection looked back at her, tired, pale, and much older than her years. She whispered to herself, Stay strong, Emily. Her lips were chapped from the wind. Her fingers ached as she tightened her grip on the coin box. She walked further, past dim street lamps buzzing above her. Stray dogs barked in the distance. The streets were almost empty now. The silence made her feel even smaller. She spotted another farmer, Sigh's glowing sign. Hope flickered in her chest. She ran across the street carefully, avoiding the icy patches. Her shoes slipped slightly, but she regained balance. She pushed open the door with trembling hands. Inside, the shelves looked endless. The man behind the counter was busy counting bills. Emily waited politely until he noticed her. Yes, what do you need? He asked, impatient. Sir, my mother is sick. I need this medicine, she said, holding up the note. He scanned the paper and raised his eyebrows. Do you know how much this costs? He asked sternly. Emily shook her head, frightened. It's more than $50, he said flatly. Emily slowly opened her box again. The man leaned forward, saw the coins, and frowned. "That's nowhere near enough. I can't give it to you." His tone was final, like a slammed door. Emily lowered her eyes, ashamed. "Please, it's for my mom. She's really sick," she whispered. The man sighed, but turned away. "I'm sorry. I can't do charity. Business is business." Emily stood frozen, unable to move for a moment. Her chest felt heavy, as if the cold had seeped inside her. She finally nodded, whispering, "Okay," and walked out again. The street was darker now. Shops were closing, one by one. She felt time slipping away, like sand in her fingers. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. She passed a clothing store where mannequins wore warm jackets. She pressed her forehead against the glass briefly, wishing she could stay warm. But she pulled away quickly. She couldn't waste time. She thought of her mother lying in bed, coughing weakly. She imagined her reaching for her hand, whispering her name. Emily's eyes burned, but she kept walking. She spotted an old woman selling apples at a corner. The woman smiled kindly at her. Emily smiled back faintly but didn't stop. She couldn't spend her coins on food. She needed every cent for medicine. A cold gust nearly knocked her off balance. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself. The city's tall buildings loomed above her, their glowing windows felt unreachable, belonging to another world. Emily felt very small in their shadows, but she refused to give up. She whispered another prayer, her voice trembling. "Please let someone listen. Please help Mama." A car drove past, splashing icy water near her feet. She jumped back quickly, hugging her coin box tighter. The box was all she had. She couldn't lose it. She found herself in front of yet another pharmacy. This one was larger, brighter, and still open. She hesitated, fear creeping in. What if they said no again? But her mother's face flashed in her mind. That gave her courage. She pushed the door open, her heart pounding. The smell of disinfectant filled the air. Shelves stretched high above her, full of remedies she couldn't afford. A man in a long coat stepped aside to let her pass. Emily clutched the doctor's note in one hand. She kept her eyes on the floor, nervous of the stairs. Her voice felt trapped in her throat. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to walk to the counter. The pharmacist there glanced at her briefly. She opened her box again, showing the coins. The sound of them hitting the counter seemed too soft. She placed the doctor's note beside them. "Please, sir, I just need this medicine for my mom," she whispered. The man glanced at the paper, then at the coins. His brows furrowed, but he said nothing yet. Emily waited, her little hands shaking. The world outside seemed frozen in silence. Her heart raced as she stood there, praying for a miracle. The cold night was far from over. The cold night pressed heavily against Emily's back as she stepped out of the pharmacy. Her breath hung in the air like smoke, trembling with each exhale. She stood still for a moment, gripping her coin box, unsure of what to do next. The streets were quieter now. Most shops had already closed their doors. A faint sound of traffic echoed from the main road nearby. Emily turned her head and noticed headlights approaching. A sleek black car rolled smoothly across the street, glistening under the street lamp. Its polished surface looked so out of place in the struggling neighborhood. The car slowed, pulling up to the curb just a few steps ahead of her. Emily's eyes widened. She had never seen a vehicle so shiny, so expensive. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from the faint spark of hope. The driver stepped out first, tall and composed, opening the rear door. From the back seat emerged a man dressed in a long wool coat. His leather shoes clicked sharply against the pavement. The faint scent of expensive cologne carried through the breeze. He adjusted his scarf casually, not noticing the girl at first. Emily swallowed hard, her palms sweating despite the freezing air. Something inside her told her this was her chance. She had hesitated with shopkeepers, but now hesitation could cost her mother's life. Gathering all the courage left in her small body, she stepped forward. Her voice quivered as she spoke. "Sir?" The man, mid-step, turned his head sharply. His brow furrowed slightly, surprised to hear such a fragile voice. Emily clutched the coin box tighter, her knuckles white. "Please, sir, my mom needs medicine," she stammered. Her throat tightened, but she pushed through the words. I don't have enough money." Tears welled up in her eyes, glistening under the street lamp. The man, Richard, stopped walking completely. His driver looked uneasy, shifting his weight. But Richard raised his hand slightly, signaling him to wait. Emily's small figure stood before him, fragile against the vast night. He had heard many people beg for help before. In business, he was approached often by those seeking donations. But this felt different. Her voice was not rehearsed. It cracked with genuine fear. Her eyes weren't pleading for wealth, but for life itself. Richard studied her silently, his breath fogging in the air. Emily fumbled with the lid of her coin box. She opened As's, showing him the coins she had collected. They shimmered weakly in the dim streetlight. "This is all I have," she whispered. The box trembled in her hands as she held it out to him. Richard glanced at the coins, then back at her face. His sharp businessman's mind, usually calculating, faltered. He saw not numbers, but desperation. Emily's lips trembled as she added, "The doctor said she'll get worse without it." Her words pierced the silence between them. The driver cleared his throat, impatient, but Richard ignored him. "What's your name?" Richard asked softly. Emily blinked, startled that he had spoken. Emily," she replied, voice barely audible. Richard tilted his head, studying her more carefully. Her cheeks were red from the cold. Her coat was thin, threads hanging loose at the edges, and yet she stood straight, trying to appear brave. "Where is your mother?" Richard asked next. Emily's voice broke slightly. "At home. She can't get up." Richard's chest tightened against his will. Something about her honesty stripped away his usual defenses. He had grown accustomed to saying no without hesitation, but now the word felt impossible to form. Emily stepped closer, almost shyly. "I'll work, sir, I promise. I'll do anything. Please help me buy her medicine." Her words came out rushed, desperate. Richard blinked slowly, caught between logic and instinct. He could easily walk away. It wasn't his problem. But he didn't move. His feet felt rooted to the ground. For the first time in years, he was unsure of himself. He looked at her small hands, holding that rusty box. It was the kind of determination he rarely saw in adults, let alone a child. The driver sighed, muttering under his breath, "Sir, we're running late." Richard didn't answer. His focus remained on Emily. Her eyes shone with unshed tears, but she hadn't broken down completely. That quiet strength stirred something deep inside him. "Show me the note," Richard said at last. Emily quickly reached into her pocket. She pulled out the crumpled doctor's prescription. Her hands shook as she unfolded it carefully. Richard took it gently from her. The paper was worn from being clutched too tightly. His eyes scanned the name of the medicine. He recognized it immediately. It was costly, far beyond the worth of the coins in her box. He exhaled slowly, lowering the paper. Emily looked up at him anxiously, searching his face for an answer. The silence stretched long, broken only by the whistling wind. Richard felt his chest tighten again. He had lived his life believing money solved problems only in business. But here, money meant something far simpler: life or death. Emily finally whispered, "Sir, please. Just enough for the medicine." Her voice cracked, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Richard's jaw clenched unconsciously. He had built walls around his heart for years, yet this small child was tearing them down with a single sentence. The driver shifted uncomfortably, watching. Richard ignored him once more. He crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Emily's height. "You've been out here alone tonight?" he asked gently. Emily nodded, wiping her cheek with her sleeve. "Mama couldn't come. She's too weak, she whispered. Richard felt a pang in his chest, stronger than before. The raw honesty in her eyes left no room for doubt. He studied the little coin box once again. Every cent inside was a testament to her effort. This wasn't a trick. It was a daughter's love. His hand almost lifted, but he stopped himself. He wasn't used to deciding with his heart. And yet tonight he felt something shifting. Emily lowered her gaze, thinking he was about to turn away. Her tiny shoulders slumped in defeat. She whispered so softly it was almost lost in the wind. "I can't lose her, sir. She's all I have." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. He straightened slowly, gripping the prescription in his hand. His expression remained unreadable. But inside, something cracked open. Emily waited, frozen, unsure if he would walk away or stay. Her breath came in shallow bursts, fogging in the air. The world seemed to pause around them. Richard finally let out a long breath. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but softer than before. Her eyes lifted instantly to meet his. He studied her face for another long moment. There was no greed there, only pure desperation. And beneath it, a fierce love for her mother. He could not ignore it. Still he hesitated, as if fighting an unseen battle within. The driver checked his watch impatiently, but didn't interrupt. Richard remained silent, his thoughts colliding. Emily's lips trembled again as she whispered, "Please, sir." Her voice was barely audible, but full of hope. The sound tugged at him harder than anything in years. Richard finally moved his hand. Slowly, he folded the prescription back into Emily's tiny hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and he felt how icy cold she was. A protective instinct stirred unexpectedly. His gaze softened, though his jaw remained firm. He glanced once at his car, then back at the little girl. His decision lingered at the edge of his lips, unspoken but building. Emily's heart pounded, waiting, hoping. She clutched the paper against her chest, unwilling to let go. The silence felt endless, heavy with meaning. The driver shifted his feet nervously, breaking the stillness. Richard's eyes locked on Emily's once more. He saw the determination hidden behind her fear. And in that moment, he knew this was no ordinary encounter. He opened his mouth slightly, ready to speak. Emily held her breath, clinging to every second. The cold night wrapped around them, but inside, something warmer began to stir. The desperate plea had been made, and Richard could no longer turn away unchanged. Richard's lips tightened as he weighed his next words. If habit told him to walk away, he had seen too many scams before. Charity cases often ended in disappointment, he reminded himself. His world was built on contracts, deals, and trust only when written in ink. And yet, the fragile figure before him was different. He cleared his throat, forcing authority into his voice. "Emily," he said firmly, "I can't just hand money to anyone who asks." The driver nodded faintly, relieved at his employer's usual response. Emily's head dipped, as though she expected rejection. But instead of running away, she carefully lifted her coin box again. She opened it slowly, the coins clinking softly. They sparkled faintly under the dull glow of the street lamp. With trembling fingers, she held the box higher. "This is all I have," she whispered. Her voice cracked, fragile but steady. Richard looked at the coins, quarters, dimes, even a few pennies. The sight was almost painful. She had truly worked for every cent. It was not begging. It was sacrifice. "But it's not enough," Emily added quietly. Her eyes didn't look away from his. They were wide, filled with tears she was trying not to let fall. Richard inhaled sharply, caught off guard. Something inside him shifted, breaking through the wall of skepticism. He remembered nights long ago when he too had gone without. Memories flooded his mind, uninvited. A boy sitting on a broken step outside a one-room house, his stomach growling, his pockets empty, watching his mother struggle with fever, wishing he could help. Richard blinked quickly, as if the memory stung. He had buried that life deep beneath years of success, but Emily's trembling hands had unearthed it again. For a moment, the busy streets and flashing wealth around him vanished. He saw himself in her, helpless but determined. His chest grew tight with something unfamiliar, empathy. Emily mistook his silence for disapproval. Her small shoulders hunched as if she carried the weight of the world. "I tried so hard, sir," she murmured. Her words pierced him deeper than she realized. Richard pressed his lips together, unable to respond immediately. The driver shifted uncomfortably, sensing his hesitation. Emily clutched the coin box tighter, as though protecting her last hope. Her fingers shook so badly the coins rattled. Richard couldn't tear his eyes away from her hands. They were thin, reddened by the cold, nails chipped, hands far too young to know this much struggle. He thought of the contracts he had signed with those same hands years ago. Only, back then, his hands were just as desperate. He had worked through hunger and loneliness to climb to where he stood now, and in Emily, he saw the very beginning of that same struggle. His chest ached unexpectedly, as though something old had cracked open. He told himself he was imagining it, but the warmth spreading in his heart betrayed him. Emily's eyes searched his face, desperate for a sliver of hope. He realized he had been staring too long without speaking. "Emily," he said softly, the sternness gone from his tone. She looked up immediately, hopeful but cautious. He hesitated, fighting the instinct to remain distant. His mind told him, "Don't get involved." But his heart whispered, "She reminds you of who you once were." He clenched his jaw, caught between the two voices. The driver cleared his throat again, breaking the silence. Richard raised a hand, silencing him without words. Emily's lips trembled, unsure of what his gesture meant. Richard bent slightly, lowering himself closer to her level. The action surprised even him. He hadn't bent toward anyone in years, always towering, always in control. But now he wanted to see her more clearly. He wanted her to know she was being heard. Emily's breath hitched, not expecting him to come closer. For the first time all night, she didn't feel invisible. Richard studied her carefully, every detail. The patches on her coat, stitched unevenly by a loving but tired hand. The cracks in her shoes that revealed her socks, the dirt on her cheek where she had wiped away tears earlier. These were not marks of laziness, but of resilience. Emily clutched her box higher, offering it like a sacred treasure. "It's all I have," she repeated, her voice firmer this time. Richard's throat tightened unexpectedly. He had once held out his last coin too, hoping someone would understand. The memory struck him harder now, layered with regret and gratitude. He had forgotten what it felt like to beg without shame. Only love. Love, for the only person who mattered. Emily's love for her mother was written in every trembling gesture. Richard turned his gaze away briefly, hiding the emotion in his eyes. But Emily caught the subtle shift in his expression. Her heart fluttered with a fragile sense of hope. She had reached him, even if only a little. Richard exhaled slowly, his breath forming mist in the air. For years he had built his fortune to shield himself from vulnerability. Now a little girl was tearing that shield down with nothing but honesty. The irony was not lost on him. He straightened slowly, but not with the same cold authority as before. Something about him had changed in those brief moments. His driver noticed it too, glancing at him in confusion. Emily stood silently, waiting, still holding the box. Her small figure looked fragile, yet unyielding. Richard's mind replayed her words. "This is all I have." He knew she hadn't meant just coins. She had meant her effort, her faith, her everything. That realization cut deeper than any business negotiation ever had. Richard adjusted his scarf, trying to compose himself. But his hands felt heavier than usual. His heart beat faster, not from cold but from something unfamiliar. Emily lowered her box slightly, thinking he was about to reject her. The sight of her disappointment struck him sharply. "Don't look down," he found himself saying gently. Emily blinked, surprised by the softness in his voice. "You've done more than many adults would ever do," he added quietly. Her eyes widened, unsure if she had heard correctly. Richard's words weren't the kind he normally gave. Praise had never been his habit, not even in business. Yet here he was, encouraging a child he had just met. Emily's lips curved faintly, though her tears still glistened. Richard almost smiled himself, but he held it back. The driver looked away, sensing the strange shift in his employer's tone. Richard straightened his coat, covering his unease, but deep down he couldn't deny what had happened. A part of his past had resurfaced, demanding attention, and it came not through memory alone, but through Emily. She reminded him of hunger, of struggle, of love. She reminded him of the fire that had once driven him forward. That fire, buried under wealth and routine, flickered again. Emily's plea had become more than just words. It had awakened something buried in his soul. He glanced at her once more, noticing the determination etched in her face, a determination he had once worn as a boy. He wondered how long it had been since he had seen it in anyone else. His chest tightened again, a mix of pain and admiration. Emily shifted slightly, uncertain of what his silence meant. Richard finally spoke, his voice calm but heavier than before. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he admitted softly. Emily tilted her head, confused but attentive. He didn't explain further, but the truth echoed in his heart. That someone was himself. The boy who once stood with nothing but hope. Richard pressed his lips together, trying to hide the emotion rising within. He had not allowed himself to feel this way in years, and yet, here he was, heart stirring because of a stranger's child. Emily waited patiently, sensing that something important was happening. She didn't rush him, though every second mattered. Richard's eyes softened at her patience. Most people demanded, but she simply waited, trusting. That trust shook him more than her plea. He rubbed his gloved hands together, searching for words. The world outside remained cold, but inside him, warmth spread. A warmth he hadn't known in decades. Richard realized with quiet certainty his heart was no longer untouched. The walls he had built so carefully had begun to crack. And through those cracks, Emily's courage had awakened something long asleep. Richard stood motionless for a few seconds, the weight of his choice pressing against him. Emily's small frame trembled before him, her eyes fixed on his face. The coin box was still clutched tightly in her hands, though she had stopped holding it out. A single tear slipped down her cheek, quickly brushed away with her sleeve. Richard took a deep breath, his decision forming at last. Without a word, he extended his hand toward her. Emily hesitated, unsure what he meant. "Come with me," Richard said gently. His tone carried no hesitation this time. Emily blinked, confused but obediently placed her tiny hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, reassuring. The warmth of his glove contrasted with the icy air around them. He led her toward the black car waiting nearby. The driver looked startled, his brows knitting in confusion. Richard opened the back door himself, ignoring the driver's reaction. "Get in," he told Emily softly. She froze, eyes wide. In the car?" Richard gave a small nod. "Yes, trust me." Emily's chest rose and fell rapidly, caught between fear and hope, but his steady gaze reassured her. With slow steps, she climbed inside the car. The leather seats felt strange under her thin coat, soft, warm, unfamiliar. She hugged her coin box to her chest, as if afraid it didn't belong there. Richard stepped in after her, closing the door firmly. The driver climbed back behind the wheel, still uncertain. "Pharmacy," Richard instructed calmly. The engine hummed to life, and the car glided forward. Emily pressed her face slightly against the window, watching the city lights blur past. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it, but in her ears. Richard sat beside her in silence, his mind heavy with thought. For once, his silence was not cold. It was thoughtful, almost tender. Emily stole small glances at him, still unsure if this was real. The ride felt like a dream she was afraid to wake from. Soon, the car slowed in front of a brightly lit pharmacy. Richard stepped out first, holding the door open for Emily. She followed timidly, clutching her box. The warmth inside the pharmacy wrapped around them instantly. Shelves towered with bottles and boxes, each one carrying the promise of healing. Richard strode confidently to the counter, his presence commanding respect. The pharmacist looked up, startled by his expensive coat and polished shoes. Without hesitation, Richard placed the prescription on the counter. "Fill this," he said firmly. Emily stood on her toes, watching every move nervously. The pharmacist nodded quickly and went to fetch the medicine. Emily opened her coin box, ready to offer what she had. Richard gently lowered her hand with a shake of his head. "Keep it," he said softly. Emily froze, stunned. "But it's all I have," she whispered. "And you should keep it," Richard replied firmly. Tears pricked her eyes again, but this time from relief. The pharmacist returned, placing the small bag of medicine on the counter. Richard pulled out his wallet without a second thought. He handed over crisp bills, far more than the total. "Keep the change," he said coolly. The pharmacist nodded quickly, bowing his head. Richard picked up the bag and turned back toward Emily. "Here," he said, handing it to her. Her small hands trembled as she accepted the package. She hugged it against her chest like treasure. "Thank you. Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice breaking. Richard's heart stirred at the raw gratitude in her tone, but he wasn't finished yet. "We're not done," he said, his voice gentler than before. Emily tilted her head, confused. Richard walked toward another aisle, motioning for her to follow. She trailed behind, clutching the medicine. He picked up a basket and began filling it. Boxes of soup, packets of bread, canned food, all went in. Emily's eyes widened at each item. "But, sir, it's too much," she whispered. "It's enough," Richard corrected calmly. He moved to the clothing section at the back. Scarves, gloves, a thick wool coat. He added them all. Emily's mouth opened in shock, but no words came out. The basket grew heavy with items, yet Richard carried it effortlessly. At the counter, he set everything down. Emily stood beside him, overwhelmed. Once again, Richard paid without hesitation. The cashier handed over multiple bags, which the driver quickly collected. Richard turned to Emily, who was still frozen in disbelief. "These are for you," he said simply. Emily clutched the medicine tighter, her lips trembling. "Why? Why are you helping me?" she whispered. Richard paused, considering the question. "Because someone once helped me," he answered quietly. His eyes grew distant for a moment, lost in memory. Emily didn't fully understand, but her heart swelled with warmth. She nodded slowly, whispering, "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." Her sincerity hit him like a wave. He realized he hadn't heard words of gratitude in a long time. The car ride back was different from before. Emily sat holding the bag of medicine carefully, as if guarding life itself. Beside her were bags filled with food and clothes. Her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. She glanced at Richard shyly, her lips curving into a small smile. Richard caught her glance, and his lips twitched into the faintest smile. For years, he had found joy only in business deals. But tonight, something else filled him with a quiet satisfaction. The sound of Emily's relief was worth more than any contract. The driver glanced at his employer through the mirror, shocked at the change in his demeanor. Richard ignored the look, his thoughts elsewhere. Emily finally spoke, her voice timid. "Sir, can you take me home? Mama is waiting." Richard looked at her carefully, then nodded. "Of course," he said. He leaned forward slightly. "Driver, her home." Emily's heart skipped. He wasn't just helping with medicine, he wanted to see Mama. She swallowed hard, nervous, but excited. Richard noticed her sudden quietness. "Don't be afraid," he reassured. "I just want to meet the woman you've been so brave for." Emily blinked rapidly, tears threatening to fall again. She pressed her lips together, nodding quickly. The car turned down narrower, darker streets. Emily pointed the way with her small hand. "This one, sir. The little house at the end." Richard's gaze followed her direction. The neighborhood was modest, worn, but alive with quiet resilience. His car looked out of place here, gleaming among cracked sidewalks. Emily clutched the bag tighter, her heart racing. "Mama will be so happy," she whispered softly. Richard heard her words and felt an ache in his chest. He wondered how long it had been since anyone had waited for him at home. The thought unsettled him, yet warmed him. As the car rolled to a stop, Emily shifted forward eagerly. Her small hand rested on the door handle, ready to jump out. Richard placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Careful," he said quietly. Emily nodded, her cheeks flushing with gratitude at his concern. The driver stepped out to open the door, but Emily had already climbed down. Richard followed slowly, bags in hand. The night air was still sharp, but he barely felt it now. Emily stood by the gate of a small, worn-down house. Light flickered weakly from a single window. She turned back to Richard, her eyes shining. "This is home," she said proudly, though the house was humble. Richard studied the small structure, feeling a pang in his chest. It reminded him of where he had once lived. The memory struck deep, but he kept it to himself. Emily pushed the gate open, the hinges creaking softly. She stepped inside, turning to wait for Richard. He followed, his tall frame almost too large for the narrow path. Emily's excitement grew with each step closer to the door. Mama will be so happy to see this," she said breathlessly. Richard glanced at her glowing face and felt warmth stir again in his heart. He hadn't expected to feel joy tonight, but here it was, undeniable. Emily reached the small wooden door and pushed it open gently. She turned back to Richard, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Come inside, sir," she whispered, her voice full of hope. Emily pushed the door open wider, motioning for Richard to step inside. The room smelled faintly of herbs and candle wax, the only light flickering from a small lamp. Richard paused just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The house was tiny, barely 2 rooms, but it was tidy and warm despite its poverty. A frail woman lay on a narrow bed against the far wall. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, but her eyes lit up when she saw Emily. "Mama!" Emily cried, rushing forward with the small bag clutched to her chest. Sarah tried to sit up, but her strength faltered. She braced her trembling hands against the mattress, attempting to rise. "Stay down, Mama," Emily whispered, gently helping her lean back. Sarah's gaze shifted toward Richard, confusion mingled with exhaustion. He stood quietly by the door, unsure whether to approach. Emily quickly opened the bag, pulling out the medicine. "Mama, look! We got it! The doctor's medicine!" Her voice was filled with relief and triumph. Sarah's eyes widened, tears forming instantly. You managed to buy it?" she asked weakly. Emily shook her head. "No, Mama, he helped us." She pointed toward Richard with trembling fingers. Sarah's gaze shifted again, landing full on the tall stranger. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Slowly, tears streamed down her frail cheeks. You saved me," she finally whispered. Richard's throat tightened at the words. He took a slow step forward, uncertain how to respond. Emily carefully poured a glass of water and opened the small bottle. "Here, Mama, take it," she urged gently. Sarah accepted the medicine with shaky hands. Richard watched silently, his chest heavy with emotion. Sarah swallowed the pill with effort, then leaned back against the pillow. Relief washed over her tired face, though weakness still lingered. Emily sat by her side, clutching her hand tightly. "You'll be okay now, Mama. You'll get better," Emily said softly. Sarah turned her head toward Richard once more. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Richard raised a hand gently. No thanks needed. His voice was quieter than usual, almost tender. Sarah shook her head slowly, tears still streaming. Men like you don't stop for people like us. Her words cut into Richard, not with anger, but with truth. He sat down in the single wooden chair near the bed. For the first time in years, he felt small in front of someone. Your daughter, Richard said softly, is very brave. Emily's face flushed with shy pride. Sarah squeezed her hand weakly. She is all I have. The words struck Richard like a bell in his chest. He glanced at Emily, who looked back at him with innocent trust. Sarah's breathing steadied slightly as the medicine began its work. Richard noticed the relief spreading across Emily's face. A long silence settled in the room, filled only with the sound of Sarah's breathing. Richard looked around, taking in the humble surroundings. The walls were cracked but clean. A few family photos hung crookedly on the wall. A small table held 2 chipped cups and a candle. Despite the poverty, there was warmth, a here that his mansion lacked. Richard's chest tightened unexpectedly. Sarah broke the silence, her voice weak but steady. Why did you help us? Richard hesitated, staring at the floor. Because she asked, he finally said, nodding toward Emily. Sarah's lips quivered into a faint smile. Not everyone listens to a child's plea. Richard exhaled slowly, the truth of her words sinking in. Emily rested her head against her mother's arm, finally able to relax. Richard leaned back in the chair, his mind full of questions. He had faced boardrooms, negotiations, and endless decisions. Yet this small room with 2 fragile souls humbled him more than anything else. Sarah's eyes began to close, exhaustion pulling at her. Emily brushed a strand of hair from her mother's forehead. Rest, Mama. I'll watch you. Richard stood slowly, not wanting to disturb her. But Sarah's hand reached out weakly, catching his sleeve. He froze, surprised by the gesture. Please, stay a little, she whispered. Richard looked into her pleading eyes and nodded. He sat back down, his presence now softer, less imposing. Emily's eyes brightened. She wanted him there too. The 3 of them sat in quiet companionship. Richard had never known silence could feel this full. Sarah's hand relaxed, her breathing evening out as sleep claimed her. Emily leaned closer to her, watching her mother rest. Richard observed quietly, feeling the heaviness in his chest ease. He realized for the first time how fragile life was beyond his own walls. His wealth had always shielded him from seeing such vulnerability, but now it was staring him in the face. Emily looked up at him, her small voice breaking the silence. Sir, you saved Mama. You're like an angel. Richard swallowed hard, unprepared for such words. I'm no angel, he muttered quietly. Yes, you are, Emily insisted, her eyes shining. Richard turned his gaze away, not trusting his composure. His hand curled slightly on his knee, as if holding back emotions. The faint sound of Sarah's breathing reassured them both. Emily whispered, She hasn't slept peacefully in days. Richard nodded slowly. Now she can. Emily gave a tired but genuine smile. Her little shoulders relaxed for the first time that night. She leaned back against the edge of the bed, eyelids heavy. Richard watched her fight sleep, still clutching her coin box. His chest ached at the sight. Sarah's earlier words echoed in his mind. She is all I have. The weight of that truth pressed deeply into him. He wondered what it must feel like to depend on someone so small. Emily's eyes began to close, exhaustion overtaking her. She whispered softly, Don't leave, sir. Richard felt his heart twist at the fragile request. I won't, he promised quietly. The words came naturally, surprising even him. Emily's breathing slowed, her head nodding forward. Within moments, she was asleep beside her mother. Richard sat still, watching them both with quiet reverence. He had spent years in boardrooms, yet this was the most important meeting of his life. He leaned back in the chair, letting the silence wrap around him. The flickering candle cast long shadows against the walls. For the first time in years, Richard didn't feel lonely. Instead, he felt a strange sense of belonging. He glanced at the small coin box resting against Emily's lap. It held more than coins. It held sacrifice, love, and courage. His chest tightened as he realized that no amount of money could buy that. He thought of his mansion, empty and echoing. Compared to this room, it felt colder than ever. Here, in this fragile place, was something real. Sarah stirred slightly, her hand tightening around Emily's. Richard watched with quiet awe. The love between mother and daughter filled the room with warmth. He realized he was witnessing something he had missed his whole life. Not wealth, not power, but family. A tear threatened to slip from his eye, but he blinked it away. He had not allowed himself to cry in years. Yet tonight he was closer than ever. He adjusted slightly in the chair, settling in for the night. He would not leave them, not yet. Outside, the wind howled against the thin walls, but inside there was peace. Richard closed his eyes briefly, just listening to their breathing. For once, he wasn't thinking about profits, deals, or meetings. He was thinking about life, fragile and precious, and about how a little girl had changed his. He opened his eyes again, studying the faces before him. Sarah, weak but alive. Emily, small but strong. Together they had something money could never replace. Richard felt humbled in a way he never had before. He didn't feel like a millionaire here. He felt like a man, rediscovering his soul. His hand rested on the arm of the chair, steady and calm. He exhaled slowly, letting go of years of emptiness. The night grew quieter, softer. Richard remained seated, watching over the fragile family, and for the first time, his wealth finally meant something real. Morning sunlight spilled gently through the thin curtains of Sarah's home. Days had passed since Richard's first visit, and the little house felt lighter. The sharp smell of sickness had faded, replaced with warmth and fresh air. Sarah's color returned slowly, her cheeks no longer ghostly pale. Emily bustled around the small space with newfound joy. Richard had kept his promise. He didn't disappear after that night. Every day he stopped by, his car drawing curious glances from neighbors. But inside the house, there was no pretense, no business talk, only care. On his first return visit, he carried bags of fresh fruits and vegetables. Emily's eyes widened at the sight of so much food. She helped him unload the bags, giggling softly. Richard, unused to such innocent laughter, found himself smiling with her. Sarah sat at the table, watching the scene with quiet gratitude. Her voice was stronger now, though still gentle. "You've already done enough," she told Richard softly. He shook his head, replacing another basket on the counter. "Not enough," he replied. "Not for what you both deserve." Sarah lowered her eyes, humbled beyond words. Emily skipped toward him with a small apple in hand. "Uncle Richard, this one's yours," she said proudly. Richard froze at the name. "Uncle?" he repeated slowly, almost disbelieving. Emily nodded firmly. "Yes, your family now." His chest tightened at the simple declaration. He accepted the apple with trembling fingers. For the first time in years, someone had given him something with love, not expectation. He bit into the apple, its sweetness almost overwhelming. Emily clapped her hands, delighted that he accepted. Sarah's eyes glistened at the moment. She whispered, "She's never called anyone that before." Richard looked at Emily, who beamed up at him. His voice came out rough. "Then I'll do my best to be worthy of it." Emily hugged his arm tightly, her trust complete. Richard's heart swelled in a way he couldn't explain. Over the next days, he visited more often. He helped fix the squeaky door that never closed right. He repaired the loose leg of the old wooden table. Emily followed him everywhere, asking questions about tools and work. Richard chuckled at her endless curiosity. Sarah watched them, her weak body growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, Richard arrived with a box of books. "For you," he told Emily. She opened it with a gasp. Fairy tales, picture books, even a dictionary. I've never had books like these, she exclaimed, hugging them close. Richard ruffled her hair gently, something he'd never done with anyone. Her laughter filled the small house, echoing in his ears long after. Sarah touched one of the books reverently. You're giving her what I never could, she whispered. Richard looked at her seriously. You've given her love. That's more than anything I could buy. Sarah's eyes brimmed with tears, touched by his words. The days turned into a rhythm, visits, meals, laughter. Richard found himself staying longer each time. Emily began waiting by the window when the sun dipped low. She'd spot the black car and run to the door, shouting, "Uncle Richard is here!" The sound of her voice became the highlight of his day. He, a man who once avoided personal attachments, now longed for them. Even the driver noticed the change, though he said nothing. One evening, Richard brought groceries along with a new pair of shoes for Emily. She gasped when she saw them. Sturdy, warm, and perfect for her size. But they're too nice for me, she protested shyly. Richard knelt down to her level. They're not too nice, he said firmly. They're exactly what you deserve. Emily hugged him fiercely, her gratitude wordless. Sarah wiped a tear as she watched the scene. Each day, Richard's visits healed more than Sarah's illness. They healed the loneliness inside his own heart. He discovered joy in helping Emily with her reading. He discovered peace in sharing tea with Sarah at the small table. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was comforting. Neighbors began whispering about the wealthy man visiting so often. But inside the house, none of that mattered. What mattered was the bond that grew stronger every day. Emily began drawing pictures of the three of them together. One drawing showed a tall man, a small girl, and a woman smiling. She gave it to Richard with pride. "This is us," she explained. Richard stared at it for a long moment, his throat tight. He carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his coat pocket. It became his most treasured possession. One afternoon, Sarah sat across from him while Emily played outside. "You've changed our lives," she said quietly. Richard shook his head. "No, she changed mine." Sarah smiled faintly, knowing he meant every word. "She trusts you more than anyone," Sarah added. Richard's eyes softened. "And I will never betray that trust." The sincerity in his tone brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. Emily burst back in, holding a flower she had picked. "For you, Uncle Richard," she said, handing it to him. He accepted it like a priceless gift, tucking it carefully into his jacket. Emily laughed, delighted by the gesture. As the days passed, Richard noticed his mansion felt emptier each time he left them. The laughter in Sarah's home echoed louder than any hall in his estate. He realized he was no longer just visiting. He was becoming part of something bigger. Sarah's health continued to improve, though she still needed rest. Richard made sure she never worried about food or medicine again. Emily began to grow more confident, less burdened by fear. She skipped instead of walked. She laughed instead of cried. Richard noticed the transformation with pride. One evening, Emily climbed onto his lap without asking. She leaned against his chest, perfectly at ease. Richard froze, unused to such affection. But slowly he placed his arm around her shoulders. Emily sighed happily, whispering, "I wish you could stay always." The words pierced his heart with both joy and longing. He glanced at Sarah, who met his gaze with quiet understanding. "You're family now," Sarah said softly. The words sealed the bond that had already taken root. Richard looked down at Emily, sleeping against him. For the first time in his life, he felt complete. The emptiness he had carried for years was gone. It was replaced by warmth he had never known. He realized wealth wasn't measured in money, but in moments like these, in laughter, in trust, in love. Emily stirred in her sleep, murmuring his name. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead gently. Sarah whispered, "She's safe with you." Richard nodded, his heart swelling with responsibility. He didn't feel like a businessman here. He felt like a protector, a father figure, a friend. Days blended into weeks, but his bond with them only deepened. Emily's knickknacks, "me" for him, Uncle Richard, spread warmth every time she spoke it. Sarah's eyes carried gratitude whenever she looked at him, and his own heart carried peace he thought he'd never find. The transformation was undeniable. Richard, once a lonely millionaire, was no longer alone. He had found something no fortune could buy. He had found belonging, and it all began with a little girl's desperate plea. One evening, as the sun painted the sky orange, Richard sat on the porch with Emily. She leaned her head against his arm, pointing at the horizon. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Richard smiled faintly. Yes, very beautiful. He wasn't just looking at the sunset. He was looking at the life he never thought he could have. Sarah stepped out, leaning on the doorway, watching them both. Her heart swelled at the sight of Emily, safe, happy, loved. Richard turned to her and gave a small nod. She returned it, silently acknowledging what words could not capture. The night air grew cooler, but the warmth between them remained strong. Emily drifted to sleep, safe under Richard's arm. Sarah whispered softly, "Thank you." Richard shook his head. "No, thank you for letting me in." His words were honest, spoken from the deepest part of him. The small home glowed with something greater than wealth. It glowed with love, trust, and newfound family. Richard realized his life had been transformed forever. He had entered as a stranger, but had become something more. Not just a helper, not just a benefactor, he was part of their family. And that, he knew, was the greatest fortune of all.